Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, we think about progress. I've been reporting on climate change for more than 8 years. It's not because I care about an invisible gas in the atmosphere or about the mercury levels in a scientist's thermometer, but because of what climate change could do to slow down the progress that humanity has achieved over the past 2 centuries. And as I keep reporting on what the world is doing to tackle climate change, I keep coming back to the question of human progress. At the start of 2025, with the staggering fires in Los Angeles and a range of climate leaders stepping down, it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like regress, or perhaps something darker. But it's a narrative that we should be careful not to fall for. That's the message from Achim Steiner, the head of the United Nations Development Programme, who I got a chance to talk to at COP29 in November. He said that progress is happening, and there are many places in the world where you can see it. We talked about many of them. He's not denying that there are growing problems around the world, but he says that he has also never felt more optimistic about the human capacity to address them. This is the second time Achim is on the show. Previously, he made a passionate case for what humanity must do to thrive on this warming planet. This time, he shared what's working and made the case for how to make it work better. Achim, welcome to the show.
It's good to be back with you. Thank you, Akshat.
Now, since we spoke 18 months ago, I feel like the world has taken a turn for the worse. If we look at broad metrics like the Human Development Index, richer countries are doing better and poorer countries are doing worse, reversing a trend that for the last 50, 60 years was where both rich countries and poor countries were progressing. There's been the rise of populism all around the world. Many elected leaders, even if they care about climate change, aren't able to do very much. And then there are, of course, many elected leaders who are hostile to climate action. So we speak at COP29 where, yet again, world leaders are meeting, country negotiators are coming together to try and figure out how do we keep climate action alive in what is a fracturing world. How are you seeing things?
Well, I think, first of all, let us acknowledge we are confronted with a degree of crisis, conflicts, and wars, as you have just mentioned, in a way that I think none of us had anticipated. And certainly since 1945, it is without precedent. We have well over 120 million people who are essentially forced to leave their home, whether in their countries or to flee across borders as refugees. We as UNDP work at the moment in 53 countries that are deemed crisis contexts, i.e. through either economic or political civil strife or literally open wars across borders. We face the opposite of what a development program of the United Nations aspires to, namely to help countries to build a way forward, to develop their economies. We are seeing development being destroyed. So I think, yes, it is a very sobering moment in time. And we see also the geopolitical polarization translating very quickly into domestic polarization, radicalization. So the cohesiveness of societies, the ability of governments to lead through tough times is being compromised. Having said that, on the climate front, I would take a slightly different view. We are meeting in 2024 at a moment in time where we can actually look back over the last 10 years, and we should perhaps be astonished at what the world has accomplished. The International Energy Agency estimates that in 2024, there will be around $3 trillion invested in new energy infrastructure. Did you know that 2 out of those 3 trillion will now be invested in renewables? For a few years now already, total investment in new electricity generating infrastructure for renewables is more than the combined total of oil, gas, coal, and nuclear. So to those who continue to argue that we are, in a sense, doomed, if you want, to stay or committed to staying with the fossil fuel-based energy platform for the 21st century, to them I would say you are patently wrong. What you're witnessing right now is the product of years of the international community, private sector, public sector, science, technology, converging on that challenge of a ultimately decarbonized future. And it is happening already, not only in energy. We now see it also happening in mobility, the other major polluting sector, transporting goods across the planet, whether by ship, by plane, by car, by trucks. Even that is now rapidly shifting, with a country like China this year having every second car sold in China being an electric or hybrid vehicle. So I would say on the climate response front, we are seeing remarkable things happen. What you will also hear at every climate COP and in the media right now is how far behind we are, how late we are. But that should not negate the extraordinary exponential progress that we're now seeing. And obviously here in Baku, the great challenge is, can we maintain that collective interest and momentum of countries despite all their differences, which are very pronounced, and their abilities to act, that we continue to drive forward with the Paris Agreement, which has proven to be remarkably resilient.
I think that's a good reminder for this two-track world we live in, where we will see climate progress because a whole host of actions have been taken that have momentum. I think the darkwood turn is one of whether that kind of momentum continues, because the gap between where we need to be and where we are does grow, and climate impacts grow. So if you are thinking about it from a United Nations perspective, where countries like the United States, which contribute a fifth of the budget, are electing a populist leader who does not believe as much in a globalized world, in the principles that created the United Nations in the first place, how much of a risk do you think Donald Trump is to the progress that the United Nations enables the world?
Well, let me first of all answer your question by saying, as a United Nations official, we rarely try to speak in hypotheticals. So let the newly elected administration take office, let it, in a sense, set its priorities. But clearly you are alluding to a number of policy positions and also the track record of the incoming US administration that clearly has voiced skepticism and also different views on energy pathways, for example. I think, as always in our democracies, these are dramas that play out in real time. So yes, we will see a lot of announcements. The fact of the matter is that yes, the US left the Paris Agreement, the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. No one followed the US leaving the Paris Agreement in 2017, and the world welcomed the US back. In the meantime, I think we will also see in the United States, I think what we are seeing in many countries, acting on climate change today is not anymore focused on stopping to do things. That was very often where the science had to awaken us and rattle us, if you want, to say, do you realize that with what you are emitting into the atmosphere, you're essentially killing off economies in the future, and you're making life on this planet extremely untenable, expensive, and economically very challenging. But in today's world, we're actually far more focused on the green economy that is emerging as an opportunity. The next strategy for industrialization, the next strategy for how we power our economies, mobility in the world, but also looking at where jobs will come in the future. Just on the simple preoccupation that many governments have, how do we create enough jobs? An investment in renewable energy infrastructure on average creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than one in the fossil fuel sector. If you essentially are worried about your automotive industry, as Europe and parts of North America are, ask yourself, are you really going to manage to survive in a world where electric mobility has become not only affordable, ever cheaper, and there are now major producers that are able to supply the world market? Because the US economy is large in monetary terms, but the vast majority of the world's population lives outside the United States. So are we going to see electric mobility succeed on the African continent with soon 1.5 billion consumers, so to speak? And is the old fossil fuel-based, diesel, petrol-based automotive industry really going to be a competitive proposition there? So in domestic US policy terms, I think industry, investors, markets will be looking carefully at where does a policy ultimately undermine the competitiveness of a US enterprise. And secondly, you also have in the United States federalism. So state governments also represent a very significant part of the mandate that shapes policies. You asked me in terms of a United Nations perspective. We are obviously very concerned, principally because when a major economy such as the United States takes a step back from an international consensus, it will always have an impact. It will slow things down. It will sow distrust. It will create, let's say, more room for skepticism. And let's also be clear, already now we are seeing signals where investors are holding back. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, will ultimately not be invested in the United States because the policy and regulatory framework is ultimately signaling that you're not welcome. And they will invest somewhere else because the demand is growing exponentially around the world.
The other thing that has happened when you look at this turn in politics is one where climate or carbon cannot become the top priority for almost any nation. The top priority happens to be, in most places, even in rich countries, economic growth, prosperity, affordability, cost of living. And those metrics have caused a rightward turn toward populism. So when I think about what's happening in the world, I am reminded of our previous conversation on how the Sustainable Development Goals are this unifying set of principles that address multiple problems at the same time, where they address prosperity while they address climate change. But we are also not on track. You've said the world is likely to miss the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 because there will be still plenty of poverty in 2030. So is there any movement to try and re-engage the world in the SDGs? Because it seems to me if climate change is to be tackled, it really has to happen through a systemic lens like the SDGs rather than just focusing on carbon.
Let me perhaps begin by saying, particularly to those listeners who are not so familiar perhaps with the 2030 Agenda, as it was called, and the Sustainable Development Goals, that these are 17 goals that in 2015 the international community agreed to collaborate on addressing. And to some, they want to argue that the SDGs are some form of political theorem or an ideology. They're not at all. They're the most pragmatic way of looking at the conundrum that we are now facing as 8 billion people soon on this planet. How are we going to survive in the 21st century together when our planet is under stress, our societies are struggling with inequality and a lot of political strife, and ultimately we still have generations of young people who are leaving schools and universities looking for jobs. In many countries, that equation is no longer delivering. So the first thing that we need to accept is, yes, life is more complex in the 21st century. And to give you a very simple illustration of how we interpret in the United Nations Development Program, when we go and offer our support to developing countries, we don't tell them, oh, you must do something on SDG 13, climate change. We say to them, how can we help you with your development? We are an organization that can help you think about the future of your economy and then make the investments today. Now, we might do exactly the same project, for instance, to address access to affordable and clean energy, which is Sustainable Development Goal 7, that automatically delivers on SDG 13 on climate change, reducing carbon emission, but actually also on SDG 1, reduction and elimination of poverty. In designing one project, we can address poverty reduction, access to clean and affordable electricity, fundamental to any society, any nation for its development, and reduce the risk of climate change. It's a smarter way of thinking about development. Now, the SDGs have indeed, in terms of the targets and indicators that were supposed to be met by the year 2030, fallen way behind. But we've had a pandemic, we've had wars, there are reasons why this is happening. Does it make the goals somehow less relevant or correct? I don't think so at all. On the contrary. Our challenge, however, is that there is a second element to the SDGs that is extremely important. And in 2015, in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations, in the presence of the Pope, of the Secretary General, of literally 130 heads of state and government, there was also an acknowledgement that interdependence is something we have to accept as a reality in today's world. Whether it's the pandemic, whether it is cybercrime, whether it is the energy transition, climate change, none of these challenges are really manageable within a national jurisdiction alone. We depend on the actions of others, including, for example, in the world of digital and AI, those countries that have the weakest national legislation, institutions, and capacity to deal with cyber crime, cyber terrorism, become the Achilles heel to a essentially interconnected global economy. So our work as the UN, in some ways, is more important than ever, because where countries may not be able to cooperate directly with each other because they have big differences, they can still agree that they have something in common. And this September, actually countries adopted the Pact for the Future in New York, which was a reaffirmation that despite the fact that we may not like our neighbor, we have to work together on these core issues of our time.
I spoke to a minister here at COP29 from a developing country who expressed frustration with international institutions. They were at two layers. One, where as a developing country, they have access to fossil fuels, but they're not getting any funding to tap those fossil fuels, even though their development index is very low, because the international community or international funding bodies have decided, no, the only investments that can go are in clean energy. So if you want a gas power plant, that's on your own. You need to find the money for it. The other frustration was the sheer number of international funds being created. So we had the Loss and Damage Fund. There is going to be the Global Environment Facility. There is the new target that will be agreed on at COP29, which will be hundreds of billions of dollars. Multilateral development banks have to figure out how to give that money out. And for a country, it is becoming hard to realize, even if there is money to be accessed, how to access it, how many rules do we have to follow? Is there room for the UN to actually simplify things for developing countries? And what about sometimes the need for fossil fuels in the very places where development is still far, far behind the world average?
Well, let me first of all respond to the role of international institutions. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. On the one hand, yes, international institutions can also be complicating factors. They are governed by broad constituencies, lowest common denominator consensus, the extreme attention that is put on fiduciary integrity and accountability. Yes, if we were a startup, if we were an NGO, we could operate very differently, but we're not. We are custodians of literally billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. Therefore, the United Nations, the international financial institutions, are by definition a guarantor of fiduciary integrity. Even then, we also run into problems and difficulties. I mean, there are criminals, there are those who will try and cheat us. We make mistakes. But that is not, I think, the biggest risk. The biggest risk is that member states, because of the sometimes competing interests, but also sometimes very particular interests, create many of these structures. Why do we have a global environment facility, followed by a green climate fund, followed by a fund to address loss and damage? Well, in part because countries are trying to also address particular needs. Take the world of developing nations right now. We have emerging economies in there. China, Middle Eastern nations, some of the wealthiest nations in Asia and Latin America that are upper middle income countries, alongside, for instance, small island developing states. High per capita GDP, but extremely vulnerable and can lose a third of their GDP with one hurricane in 8 hours. The least developed countries. We have now this phenomenal investment in renewables, but do you know that last year only 2% of that total trillions of investments actually landed on the continent of Africa, where the most people without access to electricity live today. So there is also a kind of public policy hedging that happens, and the product of this over years is that we get a very broad range of funds and platforms. I think it is time to review them, to consolidate them. The G20, in fact, took the initiative under the Brazilian presidency and already with India before to ask the question, can we streamline the financing? The problem is right now here in Baku, what you see is, however, the first litmus test. Is there enough trust to even believe that we are ready and willing to invest and co-invest enough to work together on climate change, or are we even debating what is an adequate level of investment? If that is not established, then it's difficult to do the more difficult job of reforming the international financial architecture, as the Secretary General of the UN has repeatedly called for over the last 3 years, because we live in a world where there is more than enough money and wealth in our financial system. But it is concentrated in one part of the world that is struggling to find ways to invest, while the majority of the world's population is desperately looking for capital but can't access it. And ultimately, this is an imbalance that we need to address.
After the break, Achim tells me where he's seeing promising climate leadership on the global stage. And if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. So are there examples of specific countries over the last 18 months where you see some of this progress actually playing out in the right way?
Oh, I can give you dozens. This is why, I sit here deeply troubled by how we have fallen behind in terms of addressing the science of climate change. But I'm actually very optimistic about our capacity to do so. You see, 20 years ago, we faced challenges that we thought we had no solutions for. Today, we live in an age where we actually have the solutions, technologically, economically, financially speaking, but what we are not doing is acting on them. Just to give you a simple example, when you invest hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies for fossil fuel extraction, then don't be surprised if it seems that somehow fossil fuels are cheaper at the pump for the consumer. But who is paying those subsidies? The very same consumers who are the taxpayers. The IMF estimates that the total impact of fossil fuel subsidies is somewhere in the range of trillions of dollars right now. But you asked me for positive examples. I will give you just 3 or 4. Let me take you to Uruguay, for example. Not one of the world's wealthiest countries at all. Together with Uruguay, UNDP and the Inter-American Development Bank worked with the Ministry of Finance on bringing a sustainability-linked performance bond to the financial markets. Uruguay raised over $1.5 billion with an interest rate tied to its emissions performance and its deforestation performance. Now, these are instruments that are raising literally billions of dollars on the markets today. So we see the financial markets moving. Let me jump to India for a moment. India already has an installed capacity of renewables of around 200 gigawatts right now. Few people realize that India in the next 4.5 years will add another 350 gigawatts, not megawatts, gigawatts of installed renewable electricity generating capacity. This is unprecedented in human history, even faster than China's investment was. And we can then go to a country such as Kenya, a classic developing economy on the African continent, today producing well over 90% of its electricity with renewables. And we can go to Namibia, where a green hydrogen investment is now happening, again signaling how Namibia can leverage its enormous, ultimately endless supply of energy through solar and wind to produce something that the world economy will need in the coming years, namely green hydrogen, to decarbonize the so-called heavy to abatement, high energy consuming sectors. And I could go on. This is all happening before our very eyes, and it is transforming, let's say, the pathway towards a net zero future.
Within that one specific constraint that we talked about the last time, debt crises, which is affecting developing countries hugely after the pandemic. Are there ways in which developing countries have managed to deal with some of these problems? Obviously, they've not gone away, but are there potential solutions like the Uruguay sustainability-linked bonds that are coming to help deal with what is a real fiscal crisis for many countries?
Well, the answer is yes and no. For the wealthier countries, this notion of a soft landing that has often been invoked after the pandemic, the high inflation, high interest rate phase, is clearly beginning to come down to more normal economic and financial market times. But no, for many of the developing countries, it has gotten even worse. And this is a great tragedy, not only in terms of the impact it is having on people, when dozens of developing countries today have to raise their health and education budgets in order to just service the interest that has exploded in terms of cost of their foreign debt. This is ultimately undermining the very essence of development, which is to invest in your people, human capital. Secondly, let us be very frank. The G20 has looked after itself, barely, but it has, and has not tackled the issue of debt, particularly for least developed countries and for those that are most indebted in our global economy today. So many of the instruments have been very slow. And frankly, we are seeing many developing countries today not able to invest in their future because they simply haven't got access to money. And we want next year all the signatories to the Convention of the Paris Agreement to come to the Brazilian COP in Belém with new national strategies, higher levels of ambition. But for many of these countries, all we're offering them is, please do more, do it quicker, and you can borrow some money from us. Thank you very much. I can hardly pay the interest on the loans I already have. And now you ask me to borrow more money. It just doesn't add up. This is why this whole finance discussion needs to become a lot more honest. And let us also be clear. When we talk about international climate finance, we're not talking about a taxpayer in Lancashire in the UK or in Sicily in Italy or in Ohio in the United States, subsidizing economies such as China or India. They are moving forward with their green economy investments out of their own resources. And I think one of the big misperceptions in today's world is that when we talk about $100 billion climate finance, or now 1.3 trillion, that's public but also private investment, that this is all somehow taxpayers' money from the north. Few people realize that China is investing hundreds of billions of dollars a year of its own taxpayer revenue to make the green transition happen. Many developing countries are using their resources to invest in climate change action, exceeding by far what the wealthiest nations are willing to put on the table as a co-investment.
It's always a joy talking to you because you come with examples and you show progress as it's happening while acknowledging the big challenges that we face. One thing that has been missing for me has been trying to find leaders who can speak to that inspiration for the larger public. Last time when Donald Trump was elected, there was a bulwark of leaders here in Europe or in Asia that stood up and said, we will take the baton on of multilateralism, of climate change. Those leaders aren't speaking up or do not sit in power today. But if you were to think of leaders that people should be listening to at this moment, who would they be?
To your listeners, I would say sometimes we may not hear the voices of leaders because we are listening to something else. We're listening to a lot of noise. Right here in Baku yesterday, I attended the launch of a G0 platform. 4 countries are stepping forward as the first nations that are carbon neutral or carbon negative as economies. And they're saying, we have done this. We are an example, and we also look to the world to work with us. They are the Kingdom of Bhutan, Suriname, Panama, and Madagascar. Now, most people may not even necessarily be able to pinpoint where those countries are on the map, but they're all over the global context. So it's not one particular corner of the world. And you have His Majesty the King of Bhutan, the President of Suriname yesterday here, the Prime Minister of Bhutan, in fact, leading the session yesterday. That's an example of leadership. Do we celebrate that leadership? Do we even reward it? Do we support it? No, we take it for granted. But these are people who have taken their countries through extraordinary change. The renewables investment programs of India did not fall from heaven somewhere. They were the deliberate outcome of a series of policy decisions where India has bet its own energy future on a rapid transition towards cleaner energy. But let me also talk to other leaders who are actually here in Baku. Prime Minister Starmer of the UK putting forward a remarkably robust new national climate strategy, committing the UK and recommitting it also to its financial pledges that its preceding government had almost walked away from. We saw Brazil, the next host of the Conference of the Parties next year, putting forward a national climate strategy with ambitions built into its own trajectory as a developing economy that are remarkable. What you're seeing over the last few years is that the leadership on climate action is rapidly shifting towards the developing world because for many of them, building the next generation of their economies, infrastructure, energy, industries, mobility infrastructure, is essentially one that is far more likely to succeed in a green economy scenario than in a 20th century fossil fuel-based scenario. Europe, final example, through the European Parliament, because let's also look to our parliamentarians, have passed legislation that commits Europe to a 90% emission reduction pathway in less than 16 years by 2040. So we have a lot of leadership out there. It's just a pity that some have nothing better to do than to denigrate it, to talk it down, or maybe some should just take a step back and say, it's not only about me, it's amazing what you have done. Let me join you because together we will get twice as far. It sounds so banal, but in all the technocratic language, in all the dynamics, in all the chessboard that is playing out at a conference of the parties, sometimes going back to first principles can be immensely clarifying.
find better stories because they do exist. Thank you, Achim.
Plenty of them and ever more. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. Those are the sounds of temple bells in Bhutan. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who is carbon negative. You can get in touch at zeropod@bloomberg.net. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcast is Sage Bauman. And head of talk is Brendan Newnham. Our theme music is composed by Wonderleak. Special thanks to Sharon Chan, Siobhan Wagner, and Jessica Beck. I am Akshat Rathi, back